Wow. Stelios, McKay, Latanya, I don't know about the rest of you, but this is what we need to do a lot more of. I'm so proud to be in an institution where we can have discussions about really, really difficult but important topics and have them with facts. And when you're stating opinion, you're stating that it's opinion. And I'm absolutely moved by what we've just observed in the last few hours here on three very important topics. Now it's my pleasure to introduce an alum of the college, one of the only three-term, there are two three-term governors, consecutive three-term governors in the state of Idaho. Both of them happen to be College of Idaho alums, Bob Smiley and Governor Butch Otter. Butch is also the longest-standing lieutenant governor, held that position under Democratic governors and Republican governors. He served in the U.S. Congress. He was an executive at the Simplot organization. And one of the things I will say about Butch, a lot of things I could say, I've known him for 45 years. He can walk across any aisle in any organization, and whether it's the Congress, whether it's the State House here, whether it's in a business, whether it's overseas, talking to a company from a different country with a different culture, he can walk across the aisle and have a conversation. And I think he's pretty proud of what he saw today, because we're not seeing enough of this in today's world where we can actually talk. And I have to tell you, I was one of those skeptics about whether we could actually have a conversation about the Dobbs decision. I wasn't sure. We had a great conversation today about a decision that affects all of us, but women more than anybody else. So one thing that no one else has at the College of Idaho ever is their picture on a Wheaties box. This is Governor Otter on a Wheaties box. We're keeping this. If we get in real financial trouble, we think this is worth a lot of money, but we're hanging on to it. We're not going to get rid of it. Butch, thanks for coming. Butch came from, he's had a hectic day, but he's a Yote through and through. You'll see him at football games. You may need to go to the beer garden to see him, but you will see him at football games regularly. So, Butch, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jim. Well, thank you, Jim. And I'll tell you, I am indeed impressed. We need a lot more of these kind of forums and these kind of serious discussions. As we grow, as we mature, I can tell you from this day forward, we're still going to have very serious problems. And they're going to be problems that need some kind of public policy solution from time to time. And so we need serious people that will talk at a decibel level other than the very top of their lungs to try to convince the other side that their facts, their opinion is valuable. And that's probably the key that I have found no matter where I go, is that, and I've been to 82 foreign countries and built plants, and for Simplot, I was the president of Simplot International for 12 years, and I had to deal in a different language with folks that didn't want us there for one reason or another. Usually the rice growers didn't want to compete with potatoes, French fries. And so they didn't want us there. But I found that if you can just calm down and have a good, legitimate discussion and based upon facts and truth. If you lose the facts, if you lose the truth, you've lost the other side. You've lost the side that you were hoping to convince. And so I've always approached it that no matter what the person's reputation was, and fortunately I lived 10 miles, I was born right here in Caldwell, 80 years ago. And I lived 10 miles, I live in Star now. So I didn't fall too far from the patch. And I grew up in a family of 11. And my dad was an electrician, so there wasn't always a whole lot of everything available because they didn't make the money they make today. And being born 6 months after Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of difficult things going on at that time. I obviously don't remember them, but I do remember with my brothers and sisters having disagreements. And we rarely came to a reasonable solution in solving the problem if we just stood there and yelled at each other. And so I think part of my background actually comes from a family of 11 and trying to persuade somebody else that our way is the way to go. My way is the way to go. And there's a couple of other things that I have figured out that in Idaho, we're blessed here in Idaho because Idaho has a very forgiving heart. And nobody, I think, in the history of politics in Idaho has needed more forgiveness than Butch Otter. In fact, when I was first elected governor, one of my great friends that I loved to debate on the floor of the House when I was in the State House of Representatives representing Canyon County, well, it was a guy by the name of Perry Swisher. And Perry had been on both sides of the aisle, but he was the smartest guy. He was a Democrat, but he had been a Republican. But he was probably the smartest guy I ever met and ever served with. And I loved to hear his debate, especially if I was on the other side, because it would generally convince me that I was either right or wrong. And if I was wrong, I'd give him credit for it. You know, the gentleman from Pocatello, Idaho makes a good point. And it's a point that should drive this entire legislature to do the right thing. Well, Perry, when I was first elected governor, Idaho's 32nd governor in 2007, wrote an article. He was also a journalist, and he was a brilliant writer. And so he wrote an article talking about Idaho having a forgiving heart. He wrote an article that Butch Otter has got to be the political Lazarus of the state of Idaho. Nobody has come back from more certain political death than Butch Otter. I had a few problems. I'm not proud of any of them, but I'm proud that I came through them. And I'm proud that I had guys like Perry Swisher reaching out to me from the other side of the aisle, reaching out to me saying, you know, Butch, it's okay. It's okay. And so just remember, whenever you're in those discussions and those debates, every saint has a past and every sinner has a future. And it's your job to make sure that they understand both sides. And you'll find that they do. And you'll find a much calmer life. Controversy in public policy is not new. I can tell you it goes all the way back to the construction of the Constitution. Now, between May 25th and September 17th of 1787, there was we called it the Miracle of Philadelphia. But there were always those, and one of them, a very famous founder, or a very famous patriot, was a guy by the name of Patrick Henry. And Patrick Henry told after they had written the Constitution that he was going to fight it. And no matter what the Federalist Papers said about it, and why are you going to fight it? And he said, I'm going to fight it because until you enumerate all the rights of man, I'm not going to sign this document. Well, they didn't need his signature, but they still went out of their way to at least ask the question, should we enumerate all the rights of man in our Constitution? You know, we had Article 1, Section 8, which is the powers of Congress. We had those, and then we had some other. But George Washington, who was the presiding officer, took that under advisement, and he said, you know, Mr. Henry makes a good point. What do you think? Should we try to enumerate all the rights of man? So he gave the question to a fellow by the name of James Wilson from Pennsylvania. And he appointed a couple of others, committee, to go study how do we enumerate all the rights of man. Well, they came back almost within 2 or 3 days, and Wilson got the floor, and I'm pretty close to quoting exactly verbatim, and he said, Mr. President, we find it unwise to enumerate all the rights of man. For in our effort to do so, we should leave one out. So leave us instead suffer our burdens, and that one that we leave out will be thought to be the property of government. So let us suffer our burdens instead to enumerate the powers of government, and all else belong to the citizens. Hence the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. And that was the promise, really, of the Federalist Papers. So they reached a compromise. Instead of enumerating all the powers or all the rights of the individual, they said, no, who's going to infringe on those powers? It'll probably be the government. So let's us instead say, these are your powers. And if you look under Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, you'll find 22 powers in there, like printing money, building militaries, having peace negotiations and peace pacts, those sort of things. Those are the powers that they're supposed to have. Then they went one step further, and they said, just to make sure, we're going to write in the Bill of Rights, we're going to write one more closing argument, and it was called the 10th Amendment. Those powers not delegated to the United States government by the Constitution, nor denied to the states by the Constitution, are reserved to the states respectfully, or to the people. And so I say that because one of the most important documents that have guided us for all of these years, that have made us the leader of the world, that have had probably the greatest addition to the quality of life in any country or any government in the world, was guided by those very arguments, which not everybody agreed on. But they looked for, and they found consensus, and they found, some people hate the word, compromise. And that compromise has led to our success ever since. And so I became part of the National Institute on Civil Discourse when, believe it or not, the guy that ran against me for the governorship in 2010, starting my second term, was a guy by the name of Keith Allred. And Keith was a reasonable guy. And he was an Idaho kid, born and raised in Twin Falls. And so he had that culture about him that I liked. And so anyway, we had a great campaign, and it was a good debates, but we never accused each other of anything nefarious or anything, even if it was true in my case. And so it was one of those debates. It was one of those races, and I've had 25 campaigns against 49 opponents, so I've seen all kinds. And I appreciated the guys like Keith Allred. So anyway, if you'll remember a few years ago, I don't know how many now, but the congresswoman from down in Arizona was shot while she was at a town hall meeting. And Gabby was shot out of hate, out of pure, when you go from the top of your lungs yelling at somebody else, that's the next step people sometimes take. And so the University of Arizona wanted to create similar to this, a course where people could sit down and talk about, in a reasonable voice, could talk about their differences and kind of try to arrive at some popular and acceptable solution. So they created the National Center for Civil Discourse. And they asked, and it was maybe, January after the November election, that Keith called me up one day and he said, Butch, I'm going to apply for this. Would you consider sending a letter of recommendation to the University of to the University of Arizona? I said, I'd love to. So I wrote him a letter of recommendation, and I thought it was a great letter, really, I did. But he didn't get the job. And so about 3 or 4 years later, they decided to create, that was such a great idea, this kind of forum, was such a great idea that they'd create the epicenter of it, where we have the biggest problem, Washington, D.C. And so they did. And Keith asked me again, would I send a letter of recommendation? I said yes. And he was living in Eagle at the time. So I sent a letter of recommendation, he got the job. And so he's now the head, the executive director or president or chairman or whatever of the National Institute for the Center for Civil Discourse. And he did very well. Called me back up after he got the office fixed and everything in D.C. And he called me up and he said, Butch, would you consider being the co-chair of the Idaho chapter? I said, I'd love to. Well, he says, I've got a caveat. You've got to select a Democrat to be your co-chair. I said, no problem. You send me the names that you want me to consider, and I picked Walt Minnick. And I picked Walt Minnick because he was always a very civil campaigner. I picked Walt Minnick because you could sit down and talk to him, and even there would be times when he'd be shaking his head like this, and you'd be shaking your head like that. But Walt would listen and then deal with your reasons that he thought your reasons were wrong and his were right. And once again, without getting violent. And so Walt and I are now co-chairmen of and I'm trying to get Keith to change the name of it. I was given a speech on this at the Boise Chamber of Commerce a while back, and I made a mistake. Imagine that. And I said the National Institute for Civil Exchange. And somebody came up to me later and they said, well, is it civil exchange or civil discourse? And I said, I'm going to try to change it because the acronym for the National Institute for Civil Exchange is NICE. I said, that's our market. That's going to be our handle. That's our brand. Anyway, we haven't done that yet, but Keith and I and Walt and I and everybody have talked about it. But we've got a great group, and it's a group that I would invite you when you do the next one of these to invite invite Walt. And invite some of the other people, because Walt and I have an agreement. Anybody can join us and join part of the group, but if you're a Republican, you got to bring along a Democrat. And if you're a Democrat, you got to bring along a Republican. And we haven't had any problem with that, because once again, I leave off as I begin. Idaho has a very forgiving heart. And I'll tell you what, if it can happen any place that I've been, it can happen right here in Idaho. And this can be the epicenter for a big change in our public policy debates. The one you just saw up there was great, but I could give you 5 or 6 more that I tried to deal with when I was the president of the Senate for 14 years, when I was governor for 12, and when I was in the United States Congress for 6. I could give you a whole list of problems, and you just think about it and you say, there's no answer to that. I know, even if there's no answer to it and one doesn't become immediately available, we still need to work on it. Let me give you just one and then I'll shut up. Because are we going to have questions? You know, I had my left foot fixed, so I can now get it in and out of my mouth with equal dexterity as my right foot. That's why they fixed it. All right, there is a discussion every year. We're talking about the state's compelling interest in unborn life. And that was the panel that just finished. And I can tell you, I was there in 1973 and voted on the first abortion law in the state of Idaho following Roe v. Wade. States had to take action. They had to take positive action to follow what Roe v. Wade said, and up to the end of the first trimester was tough because I'm Catholic. But when my priest came to me and he said, if we don't do this, we don't protect anybody. And so you better think about that, Butch. And not only that, I went through it. My youngest daughter was born almost 3 months premature at 1.13 pounds and was in the hospital. The neonatal care unit in Boise for 97 days. She was born here in Caldwell because it was one of those emergency things. I happened to be out working. They called me at 6 o'clock in the morning on the radio and said, get in here, your wife is in trouble. And it was called, where's the doc? Did he leave? It was called placenta previa. And so the placenta had become, which is the feeding mechanism for the baby, had become detached from the uterus wall. And they told me, they said, your wife's going to bleed to death. And we know you're Catholic, and we know how you feel about the unborn. And so what's your decision? I said, she's got 3 kids at home. This is my baby, and we got 3 kids at home. I want you to do everything you can to bring that baby to life, to bring that baby out. And they said, well, there's probably a 50% chance if she comes naturally that she'll live. There's probably a 75% chance if we go cesarean and take it. And so they were prepping her for the operation. I was out pacing up and down the floor. And they came out and they said something happened because all of a sudden she delivered the baby. And she delivered it vaginally. And I said, well, is it going to live? They said, well, it's 1 pound 13 ounces. We got to get it over to the neonatal care unit, which was brand new at St. Luke's in Boise. But I faced, I said it was a big deal. It was a big deal to me. And it had been a big deal to my family, my larger family, all our lives, because we're Catholic. And probably some of the most stringent rules of the church are relative to the life of the unborn. So, anyway, take the state's compelling interest in life of the unborn. And now I want you, the big discussion that we've had all these years that I've been involved in public policy, we had a big discussion on how do we protect some of these kids that are born into families that have this religious policy of absolutely no medical help. None. So I studied on it quite a little bit. And if you take a look at the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the very first amendment has in it 5 rights. And those were the rights that the founders, and I think, put in place of the importance of each. And the first one of the 5 rights is religion. And the second, speech. The third, press doesn't like to hear this, but third is press, and then assembly, and then petition of government. And so now take the first right enumerated in the First Amendment to the Constitution and lay that over this religious group. And I can understand it. I'm sensitive to them, but I don't know the answer. So you want a discussion that's going to go on a long time, because now you're talking about living human beings. You're not talking about a fetus. You're not talking about a baby in the womb. And so if the 14th Amendment, which is supposed to protect all life, is true to its nature, it's going to allow for some pretty good discussion. But somehow, if you believe that you can serve and save and fix a broken leg by praying about it, and God bless those who do. Marty's been praying for me ever since I had the operation. I believe prayer works, but I also believe there's places where God says you're going to need some help here. And that help is available. But how do you do that without violating their rights under the First Amendment? That's what Davy Crockett would have called a sock dowager. That's called the death blow. Solve that one. Thank you very much. Great forum today.